Welcome everyone to this IC4CH webinar presented by the Health Communication Research Unit at the University of the Witwatersrand. I'm Jenny Watermeyer, Director of the unit. I hope that everybody can hear me and that tech is on our side today. Thank you for joining us today, wherever you are in the world. We are very excited to have this opportunity to share some of our ongoing work. Our focus today is from simulation to clinic, building communication competence among health science students. Some of you may be wondering what IC4CH stands for. We are part of an international consortium for communication in healthcare and interdisciplinary collaboration, bringing together leaders in the field of healthcare communication. We come from varied disciplinary backgrounds, and we bring a wealth of methodological expertise to explore issues of communication from a variety of perspectives. Please visit our website for more information on who we are and what we are all working on. And what is the HCRU, the Health Communication Research Unit? We are an interdisciplinary group focused on improving healthcare through better communication. We study communication as it happens in real clinical, community, and training contexts, especially in multilingual and resource-constrained South African settings. Our work spans 4 connected areas: supporting communication in real-world healthcare interactions, building communication skills through education and simulation, understanding lived experiences of care, including those of patients, caregivers, and clinicians, and advancing qualitative and methodological innovation in health communication research. And today's presentations are going to touch directly on each of these pillars. We work across disciplines, languages, and sites with a strong commitment to equity, collaboration, and producing research that has real-world impact on healthcare practice and training. We are also deeply invested in finding contextually relevant solutions to identified problems in healthcare practice. This is a great opportunity to showcase some of the excellent work that is being done on the African continent. Our work is centered here in Johannesburg, South Africa. This is an incredibly vibrant metropolitan space, but it also serves as a microcosm for complex public health care. The socioeconomic disparities and structural institutional demands in our context directly shape how healthcare workers and patients interact every day. So at the top on the right, we've got a picture of our university in spring glory, not so beautiful at the moment in winter. And at the bottom, we've got a picture of our city of Johannesburg, where we are all based. So South Africa has 12 official languages, and this provides a very rich background for understanding issues of access and equity. Interactions involving linguistic and cultural diversity are an everyday occurrence, with a high percentage of citizens being multilingual. And this language map just gives a bit of an idea of just how multilingual and diverse we are in terms of languages in this context. Our healthcare system is also a challenging one, with a massive divide between the world-class private sector and the often dysfunctional public sector that serves the majority of the population. In these heavily burdened public spaces, traditional medical education is put to the test. To function in this complex landscape and provide quality care to patients, healthcare professionals must be able to collaborate across disciplines and work and communicate effectively across diversity. This brings us to the core question we are tackling today in our webinar. How do we transition students effectively from the classroom to the clinic? Effective communication is really at the heart of healthcare, yet the transition from the classroom to the clinic remains one of the steepest learning curves for students. How do we equip the next generation of health science students to engage in patient-centered communication and care in this type of challenging context? To unpack these questions, our team is looking at this challenge from multiple angles using different methods. Much of our current research focuses on how simulation-based learning can prepare students for real-world complexity. Together, our team brings a combined background across speech therapy, genetic counseling, and clinical education. We all have experience as practitioners, clinical educators, and researchers. We have an exciting webinar program for you today, structured around 4 distinct pillars. So I will begin by looking at how health science students learn to communicate interprofessionally. Megan will then take us through how students learn to navigate clinical risk and uncertainty and how they communicate these concepts to patients. Nancy will challenge some of the taken for granted clinical practices, examining how everyday tasks like the way in which students ask questions during a neurological assessment with a patient need to be reconsidered. Finally, Rona will explore the unique perspectives and tensions that emerge when the researcher is also the educator in the classroom. Some of us will offer some provocation questions, which will hopefully spark some discussion at the end. So if you could please jot down and hold on to your questions for the Q&A session at the end of the webinar, that would be appreciated. And then I think there's a Q&A button that I will open up, and I'm looking forward to some great discussion and your thoughts and insights on what we have to present today. So I'm going to kick off with our first presentation. Just a little bit more about me. I'm a clinical educator in the speech therapy department at Wits University, in addition to directing the HCRU. And this presentation is going to focus on exploring the sequential interactional skills that students use to navigate their roles and learn how to work together across professions. So I'm reporting here on quite a big team project, and I'll show some acknowledgements at the end, but there are a lot of people working on this project across many health science disciplines at our university, which is such an exciting opportunity, and the first time for many of us that we have worked as clinical educators and researchers across disciplines in this way. So just to introduce the topic, we know that healthcare requires teamwork and collaboration in order to be successful, but at the same time, medical education is often very siloed, with limited opportunities for students to interact with one another during their training. Simulated interprofessional education, or IPE, opportunities offer a potential solution where students can get to know each other and practice skills in a safe environment. However, there's very limited research on IPE, particularly in global South contexts like ours. As noted earlier, our students aren't just learning to work in teams, they're learning to be health professionals in very challenging care spaces and to navigate a very divided public-private system and a multilingual patient landscape. So we know from several research and review studies that we've completed in the last few years that research into simulation-based approaches for clinical training often neglects to explore what students are actually doing in a simulated learning experience, how they actually interact with each other, and how they learn together. So instead, the methods used in these kinds of research studies looking at simulation tend to focus on data from surveys or interviews or focus groups, or else some kind of checklist-based analysis of a recording of the simulation. So there's a gap in terms of research that looks directly at real-time communication practices. So our project had several aims. Firstly, we wanted to actually establish an annual IPE activity as a regular feature of our health science students' curriculum. And then we wanted to explore how students learn to communicate together. So we ran IPE activities. We actually ran them last year and this year, and 2024 as well, although I wasn't involved at that stage. So I'm looking today at last year's data, which involved 18 groups of students across 2 sessions. The IPE simulated learning experiences involved introductions from the facilitators, time for the students to introduce themselves and discuss their roles, time to plan a team assessment, and then the students had to work together in teams to assess an SP, a simulated patient, playing the role of a stroke patient. And there was a little case study and scenario that they had to engage with as well. After each session, each group engaged in a formal debrief session with the facilitator. So we've collected a lot of data from this project. So this is the 2025 data. The logistics didn't allow us to record every simulation session, so we don't have videos of all 18 sessions, but this list in itself is data for life. There is a lot of data here. These are very detailed sessions that we managed to record. So before we look at the video recorded interactional data, which is really what I want to focus on today in this presentation, let's briefly look at what we have seen coming through in the other data. Here we see quite an interesting tension. On the one hand, our survey feedback was overwhelmingly positive. The students loved the IPE collaboration. They wanted more. They really found it positive. It was an opportunity to model skills to other students, etc. But what the facilitators noted was a few concerns. For example, very variable team cohesion, varied student readiness. So some students were more ready than others in terms of professional groups. And some students really struggled to navigate the case. So this tells us that wanting to collaborate and actually knowing how to do this interactionally are quite different things. So to understand how students navigate this difficult terrain, we really need to look past this kind of survey and focus group data to see how the students actually talk to each other across professional boundaries. When we started doing some unmotivated looking and just watching the video recordings of the simulated experiences, there were several aspects that struck us as really interesting. Firstly, the students' professional identity seemed very strong. Students were clearly embodying their own professions. We also observed several hierarchies in place, particularly when the medical students were present, which seemed to shape the way in which the students interacted with each other across professions. For example, only medical students asked questions when they were present. None of the other students asked questions. But in the 2026 data, where we had groups with only allied health students, we couldn't shut the students up. They had so many questions to ask each other. So there are hierarchies at play. We started trying to unpack some of these observations with these research questions in mind. How do health science students interactionally manage epistemic territories and manifest professional category boundaries? And how do they display, negotiate, and resist interprofessional integration through localized interactional practices? What I present here is still in the early stages of analysis, but our ongoing analysis is showing that the patterns observed in what I'm going to show today seem to be present across the data. So I'm going to show some excerpts from one particular group discussion. In this group, we had medical, physiotherapy, occupational therapy, and social work students present, with a clinical educator as facilitator. So here is a screenshot just to give you an idea of the group setup. Let's have a look at an interactional excerpt. I'm going to play just the audio for ethical reasons. And please accept apologies here. Recording was an absolute nightmare, as you can imagine, with a group so large. So there are a couple of inconsistencies in volume across some of the excerpts, but hopefully you can follow along with those. Just see if I can increase volume. So the excerpt starts with a physiotherapy student, PT1, who has volunteered to lead the group's assessment planning before the simulation begins. Here we see movement between high authority and deep tentativeness. She begins with a description of how she would approach an assessment with a subjective and an objective component. Her approach is quite tentative and hesitant, with a lot of hedging and respect for the other professionals in the room. For example, in line 9, she says, "I don't know if everyone thinks there's a better way to do it." However, what we also see happening here is that the PT1, the physiotherapy student, sets up a very profession-specific siloed approach to assessment by proposing that each field tag teams after each other, rather than engaging in a fully integrated, simultaneous, collaborative assessment of the patient. In the real world, this may happen in practice, but for the simulated learning activity, our intended outcome was for the students to figure out how to work together to plan an assessment as a team. The excerpt continues. So in line 12, a medical student, DR1, hesitantly asks a question related to terminology. She prefaces her question as potentially dumb. There's a high epistemic cost for a medical student to admit ignorance, hence the nervous laughter and self-deprecation as part of face-saving work. The group's reactions in line 14 and 15 are a critical moment of solidarity and conversion of a tricky moment into a shared, safe learning space. We see a few other instances of this type of tentative phrasing of "can I ask" across the data set, used as an action preface and always followed immediately by the question, rather than by a permission-seeking pause. And this seems to be done to manage face threats, navigate hierarchies, and buffer the risk of exposing ignorance. Even though students have not had formal training on how to interact in a team, they instinctively use politeness and sequential strategies to keep the simulation moving forward collaboratively. The excerpt continues. So when PT1 explains subjective and objective, she does so by translating it into everyday lay terms. She strips the professional jargon away to create a temporary, simplified common ground. Even while explaining the terms to create this common ground, however, PT1 interactionally reinforces the separation of the roles in line 27, with obviously each person's would be different. So she's establishing that while the process may be shared, the knowledge and actions remain siloed within individual professions. The excerpt continues again, and this is the last bit that I will play. So soon after her explanation of what subjective and objective mean, PT1 reverts back to using the specialized terminology of subjective objective. So her temporary repair and explanation of these terms is in fact not a shift towards a shared blended language, but a move to default back to her professional terminology and thus maintain professional boundaries. Returning to the previous excerpts, the use of pronouns is an interesting phenomenon throughout the data, showing a movement between the conceptualization of the team versus the establishment of individual professional boundaries. For example, in line 29, PT1 uses you guys to explicitly categorize medical students as a separate entity in relation to their clinical experience and to the other allied health students in the group. However, this is done delicately to check alignment and respect professional boundaries, seen when she says in line 30, "Is that right?" and scrunches up her face. This allows DR1, the medical student, to validate or reject her claim. Further on, PT1 shifts from I to we, and then to each degree in line 34. She doesn't refer to each of us or to the team. So the team's assessment is organized by professional divisions rather than by clinical task. And then her assertion in line 37 of I don't know seems to soften the structural dominance, leaving a democratic space for the rest of the group to agree or disagree. So this preliminary analysis lends some important observations. Students enter into professional spaces with a desire to collaborate, but navigating the boundaries of unfamiliar professional identities is challenging and creates interactional friction potentially. Students use deliberate, careful linguistic tools to safely explore and respect each other's roles for the first time. Students engage in the simulation by carefully maintaining their professional identities, for example, by using pronouns to mark boundaries, translating terminology to involve others, while simultaneously protecting territorial knowledge, and navigating the clinical space without collapsing respective professional silos. So there's a dance going on here as the students try to successfully build their first bridge of shared interprofessional understanding. So what are the implications of this preliminary analysis? When students are thrown into an interprofessional space for the first time, their professional identity is highly fragile. Asserting their own knowledge firmly while being tentative about others shows they are consolidating their own professional identities and anchoring themselves in what they know and what feels safe while respectfully approaching a boundary. So maintaining silos is not a bad thing, even though the health education literature unanimously tells us it's a very bad thing that people go into silos when you're working in a team. Here we see something quite different. What we also observed is that the students appeared more confident about interacting with the other professional groups once they'd had a chance to chat with their own classmates and sort out and consolidate their own professional perspective for tackling the case scenario and the mock assessment. We also need to consider whether we're expecting too much of our students at once. Our approach to simulated learning experiences perhaps needs to be more scaffolded, where early simulation activities should focus on getting to know you, and later simulations can focus more on getting students to work together on shared tasks. Students are sophisticated communicators who know how to protect team harmony, and educators and facilitators can highlight these moments during the debriefs after the simulation as exemplars of successful team communication. Normalizing strategies like stopping to clarify and asking the dumb questions is very important for real-world preparation of these students. What we see here is that medical hierarchies and professional silos are not fixed constructs, but rather are fluid structures negotiated moment by moment. So working as a team is not just a mindset, but it's a sequential interactional skill that is carefully negotiated and managed as students learn to work together. And by examining the specific interactional mechanisms that health science students use when they work across professions, this can enable us as educators to think about how we design interventions and how we can emphasize interactional strategies that actively encourage interprofessional collaboration, rather than just hoping that students will somehow learn to work together because we put them in the same room. So I want to leave you with some provocations, just food for thought to mull over. So the first one is, if asking a simple question across a discipline or a professional boundary feels like a major risk to a student, what is one practical thing we can change in the way that we work in interprofessional education to make this concept of stopping to clarify me feel more comfortable for students? And the second provocation is, when things get uncertain, students naturally retreat back into their professional silos because it feels safe. So how do we encourage them to step out of those comfort zones sooner? So thanks for listening to my section of the webinar. There's a big team of people involved, as I mentioned earlier, who I would like to acknowledge and thank here. This is a lot of work to call. Apologies, I think I'm back. I think we had a bit of a tech issue there. Wi-Fi suddenly dropped. Who is a genetic counselor who runs a private practice, and she works with all kinds of reproductive, cancer, pediatric, and adult genetic issues. And in her spare time, continues to do research and supervise postgraduate students through the HCRU. So Megan, the floor is yours.
Hi, everyone. Sorry, Jenny, I lost you there for a couple of moments, so I hope everyone can hear me and that the tech issue has been resolved. Good afternoon, everyone. It really is such a wonderful opportunity for this meeting this afternoon, and I'm very grateful for the opportunity to present some of my postdoc work, which feels like a long time ago, but still I think has a lot of relevance, and I think an area that certainly needs further exploration. So today I'm going to be sharing just a small project that I worked on, looking at exploring risk communication training experiences amongst genetic counseling students in a South African context. So, for those of you who are unfamiliar with what genetic counseling is, it really is a family-focused, non-directive healthcare service for individuals and families affected by or at risk for a genetic disorder or birth defect. Um, like Jenny mentioned, we work across multiple areas of healthcare, including fetal medicine, fertility, pediatrics, oncology, neurology, hematology, psychiatry, and cardiology, just to name a few. Consultations are typically quite long in terms of traditional medical consultations. They're normally between 45 minutes and an hour, where we will meet an individual or a couple or multiple family members, where we will do personal and family risk assessments based on a particular genetic risk that has been identified that has a potential impact on their health or the health of a family member. It involves the education on that particular risk in terms of what it means, from a clinical management point of view, as well as long-term outcomes. We provide support from a psychosocial and emotional perspective. Often we are brought into conversations where patients are either involved at moments where bad news has to be broken in terms of genetic conditions, which often are permanent. So these are often lifelong intellectual, physical, or neurological disabilities. And we often are involved in quite sensitive conversations, for example, in moments of a pregnancy, where, for example, a termination of pregnancy is something that has been offered and needs to be discussed. And we really play a role in facilitating informed decision making. So we don't make decisions for patients or families, but really provide information that hopefully is interpreted and conveyed in a way that patients can make their own decisions in terms of what will be best going forward for them as a couple or a family or an individual patient. Risk and uncertainty is part of daily life. But the perception, tolerance, and experience of risk differs greatly amongst individuals. And risk and uncertainty are quite difficult concepts to think about and talk about because they are both subjective and objective, and everyone experiences it differently and interprets it differently. And uncertainty management really has had a renewed focus in healthcare communication, particularly in the area of genomic medicine and molecular medicine, where research and laboratory genomics and that are really playing a larger role now in clinical management for patients. And yet it is still a very new field, so there's a lot to learn still, and much of the information is probabilistic rather than deterministic. So again, we are not making decisions for patients, but we are providing quite complex information and trying to make sense of it and how it can be used practically from a clinical management point of view. So the information can be incomplete, evolving, and ambiguous, and risk is really a central component of genetic discussions. Patients may struggle to grasp numerical information and statistics. Often it is quite high-level conversations, and there's a lot of information that kind of patients have to wade through. And genetic counseling themselves, although they have to be neutral in the conversation, may have their own personal perceptions of a particular risk, and this may differ to how a patient interprets a medical risk. And genetic counselors have to be quite careful in terms of how they position themselves in these conversations. And there are lots of different contextual, social, cultural, linguistic, and interactional differences from person to person. So the process of communication, not just the risk figures, has shown really to be the most meaningful when it comes to patient autonomy and decision making. And communication really is a critical core skill in these consultations, yet it is an extremely difficult skill and something that is not necessarily easily taught in undergrad and postgraduate health science or medical curriculums. So not an easy task when it comes to actual doing, but also to the teaching part of it. When we look at genetic counseling communication training in a global context, much of genetic counseling guidelines follow Western-centric guidelines, and these may not necessarily reflect global diversity in terms of the populations that come to clinical genetic services, the geographical and global context in which these are situated, and there's limited evidence on genetic counseling training in diverse settings, and little is known specifically about the risk communication training within diverse settings. So just to give a background of genetic counseling services in South Africa, Jenny, thank you. I think you provided quite a succinct summary of sort of the highly complex healthcare background that South Africa is situated within in terms of our public services and our private services, together with really the big differences in language, cultural, religious literacy, and socioeconomic diversity, and really this high burden of disease where there are infectious diseases as well as non-communicable diseases, and genetic counseling services and genetic conditions, although being very relevant and very important, often kind of cater to the 1 to 2% of individuals that really have rare diseases and these complex conditions. So we unfortunately really get put right last in the queue when it comes to being prioritized in terms of government planning and sort of funding that goes towards it. There are 3 formal training programs for genetic counselling in Africa, 2 of which are placed in South Africa, one at the University of Cape Town, the other at the University of Witwatersrand, or WITS, and the other training program is in Ghana. And of approximately 63 million people who are based in South Africa, there are only 28 practicing genetic counsellors. So they really are sort of few and far between individuals and services for genetic conditions. So my study aim wanted to look at exploring genetic counselling students and intern communication training skills experiences specifically in a South African context. This was a qualitative study. It was conducted at the Division of Human Genetics at University of Cape Town. They have a student program that was developed in 2004. Sorry, I don't know what happened there. There were 10 participants in the study. There were 10 first-year and second-year students, and as well as genetic counselling interns, and data was collected using audio-recorded focus group discussions. And data was analysed using reflective thematic analysis. This is just a picture of where Cape Town is situated. There were 4 main themes discussed, or findings. There was theme 1, theme 2, 3, and 4. The 1 was the experience of risk communication. The 2nd was reflections of skills training, facilitators to learning, as well as contextual information.
Seem to have lost Megan again. Just give her a sec.
Sorry, Jenny, I'm having some tech issues here.
Always happens when one doesn't need it to happen. Yes. Okay. Carry on.
Sorry about that. Okay. So in terms of theme 1, this was the experiences of risk communication. Risk was seen as an abstract, intangible thing that was really difficult to convey and explain. Again, it is subjective as well as objective. There is this cognitive demand from patients that they are from students that they explained that sort of losing sight of the bigger picture due to the large volume of detail that has to be explained. Risk is subjective, and again, there's this really difference between patients versus genetic counselling perceptions, which really can lead to the risk of students or genetic counsellors becoming directive in terms of the explanation of information. And they spoke about really the importance of personalization. So the importance of really being able to tailor the information for the particular patient in terms of the right type of information that has to be explained and the format that would be the most appropriate. Some of the quotes from students was that risk is really an abstract thing. It's not a physical skill that you really can improve on. And it really is something that is difficult to teach because it really is this abstract phenomenon where people can have really different experiences and perceptions of what risk and uncertainty is. So what might be a risky decision to one individual might not necessarily be a risky decision to another patient. It really is a fragile balance. It's very hard to be completely non-directive. And what they spoke about is that we know all of these percentages, and looking back at it, in reality, none of these numbers matter. In the end, it's my job to let you know whether you are affected or not. So students really spoke about how patients view risk as binary. It either is that you have a risk or you don't have a risk, or is my pregnancy at risk of having a condition or is it not? By providing all of these percentages and really particular statistics and figures, is it really necessarily helpful? Because individuals in general tend to binarize risk. In terms of reflections on skills training, they spoke about that practice really is essential to confidence and competence, and that continuous supportive feedback is really important, and that there really needs to be this idea of sort of that how there's the shift from textbook learning all the way to gaining more experience, where they then start to feel a little bit more confident. They spoke about feeling consciously incompetent, and where the emotional and intellectual demand of risk interpretation and communicating is really tough. And genetic counseling students are often thrown in the deep end in these really sensitive scenarios in a practice where they have to talk about these really difficult conversations. And they spoke about sort of the influence of role models and supervisors and how they really are important in terms of how they learn. And often they learn sort of once they've learned from one individual, this is kind of the same way and style and approach that they would take for all of their sort of future consults. And this can have conflict when there are other mentors who do things in a different way. So theoretically, we are taught well, but I think the emphasis is on the practice thereof. One student spoke about what I've really struggled with is feeling consciously incompetent, where they lie awake at night thinking about a scenario in terms of what was said and how they approached a conversation. And they said it feels like you're thrown in the deep end, and it's the deep end that has very serious implications if you get it wrong. One student spoke about, I'm still convinced that I counsel cancers exactly the same way how I saw the first person counsel a cancer patient, because that is the one that got imprinted into my brain. Facilitators to learning, it was really around that practice is essential, like I said before, and that there needs to be this continuous supportive feedback through trial and error. And that peer learning, such as role plays, observations of each other, and feedback from seniors is really important, where they can have these safe spaces to practice in clinics, not in clinics, but in classrooms rather, and then from there to take these skills into the clinic. Encouraging reflexive practice was really considered important in terms of encouraging students to really spend a lot of time in self-reflection, and also to not only be critical on themselves in terms of what went wrong, but also to develop the confidence in terms of what went right, and really personalizing their ability to develop their own flavor and style, and giving themselves permission in terms of being able to do things slightly different to how their supervisors may have done it before them. So when talking about role plays, they talk about we can stop at the places that we get stuck. And you really have to bring yourself to the party. Take one small thing and say that I'm going to focus on this for the next 10 sessions. One participant also said, we are taught things in the curriculum, but it depends on how you put things in your own way, your own flavor and style. So some of them you use and they don't work for you. So you stop using them or you come up with your own version of it. Contextual influences were something that came up as well, that there really is this mismatch between international literature and local lived realities. Some of the big things that came up was really that the international literature often speaks about these resources that are available to individuals with genetic conditions, or that there are these very particular tests which might not be the case within South Africa in terms of what is available to our patients. There was also mention of linguistic diversity and cultural stereotyping, and that the use of translators in sessions is not necessarily helpful. And interestingly, they spoke about resource limitations shape what can and perhaps what should be communicated. So when speaking to a patient, really to tailor that information again in terms of, is this information necessarily going to be helpful for this particular patient when some of these resources are not available to them? And weighing up a patient's genetic risk with existing daily hardships. So again, in our context, there really are patients who come from disadvantaged backgrounds. And again, sort of providing a lot of statistical information for a particular risk, which is really a theory, it may or may not happen. Is this really helpful to a patient? So this is just some comments. For example, when the bottom one on participant 3, which I thought was particularly important from a contextual perspective, was when I'm explaining cancer, I say, the cells in our body, it's the same as the bricks in our house. And 9 out of 10 times when I'm sitting with a state patient, chances are they aren't even living in a brick house. So some things to consider that in our context are very different to some of the sort of Western or developed country contexts. So in discussion, when we really need to rethink some of the communication competence training, and that competence isn't a fixed skill that you set about in terms of mastering once. It really is an ongoing skill that requires practice throughout training as well as professional career. So to really emphasize to students that once they kind of reach the point of getting their degrees, that it doesn't mean that they have now mastered the skills of communication training, particularly for risk communication, that it is an ongoing lifelong skill that needs to be honed on and practiced and reflected on. And it really is something that is not easily just learnt. Textbook models are useful when starting as starting points, but can imply an unrealistic rational ideal. And real competence is built through practice and lived clinical experience that is situated within a particular setting. Scaffolding is important in initial learning, but actual skill comes with time and there's a need to create confidence in students and the permission to develop own styles and the ability to learn through trial and error. Students as collaborators in their learning was really an interesting point that came out of this initial study. Students are not and should not be passive recipients of training. Rather, they are active collaborators. Mentorship and reflective practice builds self-awareness, but it only works with real student buy-in and the trust to let students find their own counseling styles. Part of student buy-in is co-learning, the idea that learning from and learning with, and that learning from each other and self-learning through reflective practice, as well as learning from seniors as well as from junior students. We are all in the same boat, or letting students know that these are difficult skills and that we are all learning together. And I think this is often very different to some of the more traditional approaches, which is really much a top-down teaching experience. The idea of collaborative student learning, and that it is kind of giving the floor and the permission to learn from students and allowing students to learn from each other as well, not just from a hierarchical sort of senior perspective. In conclusion, risk communication is really an ongoing process and that praxis is key, and creating context-specific genetic counseling training curricula is essential, yet challenging, particularly in resource settings like South Africa, and that further research and insight is needed from other global and local settings to really understand how these communication processes occur, how the teaching occurs, and how these can be enhanced. I'd just like to thank the following individuals, and as well as the research participants and the study site.
Thanks so much, Megan, for sharing your insights from a Global South perspective. I'm going to hand over now to Nancy, who's going to take us through some of her data, which is very exciting, from simulations that we've been running in speech pathology. So Nancy is also a clinical educator in speech therapy. She runs her own private practice, an adult neuro practice, and she's just finished running 85 kilometers in the Comrades Marathon on Sunday and is here with us today and doing very well after such a long race. So thank you, Nancy. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Jenny. Good afternoon, everyone. As Jenny said, my name's Nancy Barber. I'm a speech therapist, I'm a lecturer, and I'm a researcher. And this afternoon, I'm going to be discussing taken for granted healthcare practices. They're things that we kind of have happening in our everyday clinical practices that we kind of take for granted, that students should know how to do these things, that students should be aware of how to do them, aware of how to engage with them, and then aware of how to respond to patients. But we found that this is something we really do take for granted. And I'm going to be looking specifically at questioning during something that we do called orientation. But before I go into that, I'd just like to give you a bit of a background about speech therapy, because a lot of my work at the moment is looking at communication within speech therapy and specifically communication within speech therapy students, and how we observe that communication even when they are interacting with simulated patients within simulations. So before we go into that research, as I said, I'm just going to give you a little bit of background about speech therapy. So first of all, speech therapy within the South African context. So speech therapists, we work with a range of patients from pediatrics to adults, but my focus in my career and also in my research has been on how speech therapists work with adults, and specifically adults who've had neurological insults like strokes or traumatic brain injuries. And as speech therapists, we work with patients throughout the continuum of care. And we assess and treat, usually through dynamic assessment, speech, swallowing, receptive and expressive language skills, as well as skills related to cognitive communication. So we assess and treat orientation, attention, memory, problem solving, and executive functioning, and how those impact on a person's ability to communicate. So we have quite a wide range of communication skills that we do assess. I hope I'm back. Mine was doing something funny quickly.
Yes, you are.
And thanks, Jenny. I don't know why it also there's doing some weird things. But with like in my opinion, I was always like, well, we're speech language therapists. We should be communication experts, and we should know how to communicate with our patients, with family members, with caregivers, with other healthcare professionals, because we are communication experts. And so when we started doing simulation-based learning within the speech therapy department, it was about how can we use simulation-based learning to teach our students clinical skills in a safe space where they could make mistakes, where they could learn how to do things better before that we release them to work with actual patients. And quite quickly, when we started going through the videos of the simulations that we had recorded of our patients, we really realized quickly how there was something happening with their communication skills and something going on with how they were communicating with patients during tasks that we kind of took for granted that they should just be able to do. And one of these that really stood out to us was their questioning during case history taking and their questioning during orientation. Now, orientation is a part of our assessments that a lot of healthcare professionals do, not just speech language therapists, where we want to understand what our patient understands about their current situation. Do they know who they are, where they are, what time it is, what happened to them? But not only that, orientation in the ICU specifically and in the acute care units is really important, because there's been quite a bit of research to show that if your patients are provided with orientation and are orientated to what has happened, where they are, when it's happening, and all that kind of thing, they're less likely to get an ICU delirium, which can really impact their recovery and road to recovery. So when we saw this communication happening in the simulations and these concerns about communication happening in the simulations, we decided to dive a little bit deeper into analyzing the conversations that were happening during the simulations. So there's been a lot of research in simulation-based education on how students learn, especially in the debriefs, which is a part of simulation that happens afterwards, but there hasn't been a lot of research on what's actually happening during. So similar to what Jenny spoke about right at the beginning, I wanted to know what was going on during that students learned about, what was happening in their communication that either facilitated learning or didn't, and could also help us to improve their communication So this led us to looking at the fact that during these interactions, especially within orientation, there's a lot of what we call known answer questions. So as clinicians, we are, and as healthcare professionals, we often ask our students, ask our patients questions that we know the answers to. And our students, when they're engaging in these known answer questions, they'll usually have a checklist to help them to remember to ask all these questions. And we thought, well, I specifically thought that then if they had their checklist and they had their little plan, that this would go quite well and they'd be able to get all the information they needed. But when we were watching this, we had to stop and think what was actually happening when our students used these kind of questions. We really, well, I shouldn't just say the royal we, I really assumed that our students would know how to ask questions and then would know what to do with the answers that the patient provides them with. And so again, when we looked at this, these video recorded simulations of patients engaging with a simulated patient who was acting as if they had a traumatic brain injury, we saw some very interesting things. And I'm going to play you a snippet of one of these interactions. And this is just one interaction, but we've seen this happening across multiple interactions. So just give me a second and I will play it for you. All right, so what do we see the student doing here? She is repeatedly going through a sequence of asking a question like, what is your age? Getting an answer, the patient saying in line 151, not really sure. Saying okay in a line 152 and swiftly moving on to the next question in her list. And we see this happening repeatedly throughout this one interaction. So she definitely progressed through her assessment, but did she gather any information? Maybe she was able to assess that her patient was not oriented, but did this sequencing and the interaction actually develop the conversation? Did it help develop any rapport with her patient? And was there any therapeutic interaction happening at all during this? So this takes us on to think what we were seeing here is the students having an interaction sequence, which we often see in the literature with known answer questions. It creates a sequence called an IRE sequence, which is we have an initiation of our student asking of our clinician asking a question. We get a reply of our patient answering. We get an evaluation where a clinician evaluates the response. But what ends up happening here is the clinician repeatedly evaluates this response using the word okay. And that okay doesn't really do anything other than pivot. And previous research has also shown that okay can be used as a pivot particle, which means it will just take, it will allow the speaker to change to the next thing that the speaker is wanting to say. And in this case particularly, it's being used to close down a prior activity, so the prior activity of what is the age, and transition to the next question of, okay, so what year is it? To closing down that interaction to, okay, where are you? And so it's just a kind of closing the sequence, move on, closing the sequence and moving on. And this is just one use of okay within the conversation analysis literature. We can end up using okay for a whole lot of different functions. For example, we can say okay when we want to signal that enough information has been obtained. We can use okay to mark the end of a sequence, and we can use okay to facilitate moving to the next task. But what we really saw happening in this interaction is that the student uses okay as an exit rather than a pivot to further interaction. So I think there's something very interesting between the connection of known answer questions, orientation questions, and the student's use of OK as a sequence closing device. The issue may not be simply that the student asks too many questions. Rather, they appear to approach orientation as a testing activity rather than an interactional and therapeutic activity. This creates that pattern that closely resembles the initiation, reply, and evaluation sequence that has been described in other literature. In the simulations, the students often initiated with their question, for which they already know the preferred answer. The patient then provides a response, and the student evaluates it, frequently through a brief acknowledgement such as okay. And similar to other educational interactions described in literature, the student's goal appears to be about obtaining the correct answer rather than exploring the patient's understanding, experience, or needs. And as a result, the interaction becomes focused on answer retrieval rather than conversation. And this use of okay seems particularly important. Drawing on other conversational analysis research, particularly by a researcher, Beach, his work on OK shows that it really can be a sequence closing device, and that once students had received their answer they were seeking, or even an answer that wasn't 100% correct, they would just use OK to signal completion of the activity and move to the next question. So this really, as then we saw in that beautiful example that I used at the beginning, it really does create that repetitive pattern of question, answer, okay, next question, rather than something that might engage a patient more, such as question, answer, reorient, empathize, and explore. So due to the students' patterns, they may inadvertently close down opportunities for rapport building, psychosocial exploration, and person-centered communication. The pursuit of a specific answer may restrict elaboration and limit opportunities for patients to share their experiences. And this really has important implications for orientation questioning in speech-language therapists and other healthcare professionals. Orientation should not be conceptualized solely as a cognitive assessment task designed to determine whether a patient knows the correct information, particularly in acute and critical care settings. But orientation is also an intervention. Reorientating patients to person, place, time, and situation can support cognitive functioning and has been associated with reducing the risk of ICU delirium. Therefore, the purpose of orientation extends beyond testing knowledge. It includes actively helping patients maintain their connection to their environment and their circumstances. So in these examples that I've just put up, our students' responses could transform orientation from a test into an interactional resource. Rather than closing a sequence, the student could use the information to build understanding, provide support, and create opportunities for further conversation. So instead of the interactional use of OK as an exit, which can inadvertently reinforce the testing orientation, OK with alternative responses could possibly transform assessment questions into opportunities for therapeutic conversation, patient-centered care, and clinically meaningful reorientation. So empathy after an OK could be a potentially useful tool. In a recent systematic review of communicating empathy in conversational analysis literature by Tai et al., they found that empathy is most often displayed when a healthcare professional names emotions or characterizes an experience, which leads to improved patient-centered care and communication. And so it might be really valuable to think about how we could help students learn to use empathy as a way to respond to a patient's question, answer, sorry. Display empathy, tag it on with a question at the end like, hey, for example, with this example that I've shown where she goes, and your age, not really sure, that's okay. Possibly if we had helped a student say, okay, how do we deal with when you get this answer to a question that you know what the age the patient is, you expect the patient to know what age they are, but they can't tell you. How can we reframe that with using still okay, but it can be really hard to keep track of things after an accident. Hey, you are 24 years old, and give them the answer so that they are actually then oriented. So empathy can really have the potential to transition from acknowledging emotions to problem solving. So an okay with something empathetic afterwards really has the potential to pivot the conversation sequence forwards and also assist with therapeutic interaction and still understand where the patient is at. So in closing, using conversation and analysis to analyze how our students engaged with a taken for granted interactions such as assessing orientation really made me wonder about how we teach our students. Should we be teaching them how to ask orientation questions? Or should we be teaching them what to do with the answers that patients give us? Having conversational skills to turn to in an assessment really provides an opportunity for reorientation, empathy, conversation, rapport building, and therapeutic engagement. But how we do this really needs to be further investigated. So I leave you with those two questions. Is it teaching our students how do we ask them? Or what do they do with the answers that their patients give them? So thank you very much, and thank you to Jenny, to the other researchers that have been involved with this research, and to the students who've allowed us to analyze how they're using conversation in their simulated learning experiences. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Nancy. That was really fascinating and just turning a problem on its head and thinking about it differently. I'm going to hand over to our final speaker today, Rona Natras. So Rona is a speech therapist in private practice, but also does a lot of research with the HCRU, and she's going to talk about some issues that we've been delving into with reflexivity and really thinking about our research and the process of our research. So thanks, Rona. Over to you.
Mm-hmm. Great. Right, so I wanted to share the reflexive insights that emerged from our work on a speech language pathology clinical education research project, gosh, that's a mouthful, during the COVID-19 pandemic. Okay, this was published in the International Journal of Speech Language Pathology last year, and it was entitled Inside, Outside, Upside Down, Reflections on Perspective Taking and Positionality in a Speech Language Pathology Clinical Education Research Project. So my theme is perspective, not just perspective taking in the abstract, but the messy, shifting, often very human process of trying to understand what we are seeing when we occupy multiple roles at once. This talk, I think I've gone too fast, sorry. No. This talk is drawn from a collaborative qualitative study of student-led telepractice, but more than that, it's a reflection of what happened to us as we tried to analyze that work as researchers committed to rigor as educators committed to student learning, and as clinicians committed to patient care. And what we came to understand is that these identities don't sit neatly next to each other, that they overlap and they pull against each other, and at times they actually turn us upside down. So today I want to do three things. I want to briefly outline the study that gave rise to these reflections. And then secondly, I want to share the key reflexive insights we developed about positionality and insider-outsider perspectives, as well as vulnerability. And third, I'll close with a set of practical implications for research, for training, and actually for clinical practice. Okay, so our first insight was that we undertook this pilot study to examine telepractice as a clinical education approach for third-year speech language students. We analyzed 28 video recorded practice sessions involving 4 students who were working under extraordinary circumstances. Because of the pandemic, these students had missed earlier hands-on practical experience, had little or no prior exposure to language therapy and telepractice, and were expected to quickly adapt to a mode of therapy that was new for many clinicians, myself included. So it was a big ask. Our aim for the research study was both practical and educational. We wanted to identify what supported student-led telepractice and what appeared to hinder it, so that future students and clinical educators could be better prepared. We used a multidisciplinary team and a scribing-based analytical approach. We watched the videos, we noted on a spreadsheet aspects that seemed to support or hinder the interaction, and then we met to discuss what we had seen. The diversity was intentional. We hoped that a combination of insider and outsider perspectives would strengthen our interpretation and guard against blind spots. At the outset, the classification seemed straightforward. Some of us were insiders to speech language pathology and clinical education. Others came from psychology or genetic counseling and positioned more as outsiders to the profession. But once we began analyzing that data, the distinction quickly broke down. One of the first major insiders was that our insider status was not singular. It was layered. We were not entering the project only as researchers. We were also former students, practicing clinicians, clinical educators, and in one case, a coordinator of the telepractice practicum itself. These multiple histories shaped what we noticed in the data and also what we found difficult to tolerate. A turning point when I said to Jenny, I'm going around in circles. I don't know what I'm looking at, and I don't know what we're trying to do with this project. Now, this was not so much a failure of preparation as much as a signal that my analytical lens was overloaded. Instead of only observing the interaction, I was sliding into evaluating performance, judging therapy quality, worrying about the patient outcome, and then empathizing with these poor students working under these conditions, and questioning the ethics of analyzing work produced in these emergency situations. And I might add that this wasn't a particularly helpful way to think, because the therapy had long since ended and there was nothing I could do to change the outcome. What this showed us is that positionality cannot always be mapped with a single insider-outsider binary. In our case, some of the deepest analytical challenges came not from being too distant from the data, but from being too close to it in too many ways at once. And we came to call this being an extreme insider, somebody who's multiple professional and personal identifications created an entangled way of seeing the data. So for the webinar audience working in health professions education, I think this matters because it names a common but often hidden experience. Many of us are analyzing educational practice, but we also carrying an emotional, ethical, and professional investment in the people and the systems involved. And reflexivity begins when we stop treating these investments as noise and start treating them as part of the data we are interpreting. So a second insight followed closely from the first. I found myself identifying strongly with the student participants. Watching the recordings brought back very vivid memories of my own student experience. You know, that thrill of getting your first case and preparing all your therapy materials. And then the real fear of getting it wrong and the almost terror of knowing that somebody's progress depended on your competence. But reflexivity required me to ask a harder question. Did this identification truly mean that we understood the student's experience? And of course, the answer was no. Their circumstances were fundamentally different. They were providing teletherapy during lockdown without previous face-to-face contact with their clients, with their patients, with limited practical experience, and within a broader atmosphere of uncertainty. Even when I felt kinship and was also struggling to adapt to teletherapy, I could not claim full access to their reality. And I think this was a very important insight. It reminded us that insider knowledge can create connection, but it can also create overgeneralization. We may assume that because we recognize something of ourselves in participants, we understand what matters most in that situation. In fact, we may be projecting our own history into a context shaped by different pressures, relationships, and material constraints. For researchers and educators, the reflexive task here is to acknowledge resonance without collapsing difference. We must then attempt to analyze what is happening better than the participants do so that we can make useful recommendations. As our reflections deepened, we realized that our positionality was not only layered but fluid. We were insiders in relation to the profession and to clinical education and to certain features of telepractice. But we were outsiders into many aspects of the student's lived experience, and outsiders too in relation to how participants themselves might make sense of the interactions we were analyzing. This insight moved us away from a fixed categorization of team members and towards a more dynamic understanding of positionality. You know, perspective shift across contexts, even across tasks and moments in the analytical process. Reflexivity then is not just a once-off declaration at the beginning of the project. It's an ongoing practice of noticing how our standpoint is being renegotiated in real time. And I find this especially useful for audiences who work across research, teaching, and service delivery. If we accept that we can be both inside and outside the research experience at any time, we become less invested in defending a position and more interested in tracing how perspectives shapes interpretation. And then this, in turn, can make team-based qualitative work more honest and our conclusions and recommendations more relevant. Another major insight concerned vulnerability. As we analyzed our recordings, we became acutely aware that these were not neutral data points. These were moments of exposure. The students had allowed their early clinical work to be seen and scrutinized. Patients and caregivers had entrusted their interactions to clinical and research processes. And as authors, we were asking how to write about these realities in ways that were rigorous, without being rigid, critical without being diminishing, and truthful without losing compassion. This was particularly charged because clinical educators researching clinical training occupy positions of authority. Students don't choose many aspects of their placement context, and they are often evaluated within systems that they don't create. This means that reflexivity must include not only questions about interpretation, but also questions about power. Who is being described? Who gets to define what counts as good clinical practice? And who bears the consequences of our analytical claims? For us, honoring vulnerability meant avoiding two extremes. One was overprotection, where discomfort might prevent us from saying anything critical at all. And the other was a detached critique that forgot the developmental and relationship context in which the practice unfolds. The worth of reflexivity was to remain accountable to the students, to their patients, but also to the research. So, what do these insights mean for researchers, educators, and clinicians? Here are 5 practical implications that emerged from our work. First, reflexivity should begin before a project starts, but it can't end there. Early declarations of positionality are useful, but they're never enough. We need structured opportunities to revisit our assumptions as projects evolve. Second, we should be careful about assigning ourselves and others fixed insider or outsider labels. These labels offer useful starting points, but they can quickly become simplistic. Positionality is co-constructed, it's fluid, it's context dependent, and very much part of the research process. Third, multidisciplinary teamwork can be immensely valuable, not because outsiders are automatically objective, but because different disciplinary lenses can interrupt each other's blind spots. In our cases, colleagues outside speech-language pathology helped us remain focused when our own layered investments were pulling us off course. Fourth, where possible, participant perspective should be brought into the reflexive conversation. One limitation of our research was that we didn't directly include the perspectives of the students and the caregivers represented in the recordings we analyzed. Their voices might have challenged or deepened our interpretations in very important ways. And fifth, these lessons travel beyond research. Reflexivity is equally relevant in teaching and clinical work. For educators, making one's own assumptions visible can model reflective practice for students. For clinicians, ongoing awareness of one's positionality can sharpen reasoning, support ethical care, and improve how we work with uncertainty. So if I were to leave you with one final thought, it would be this. The value of reflexivity is not that it gives us a perfectly clear view of our data or our teaching or our clinical practice. It is that it helps us notice the lens through which we are looking. In our projects, these lenses were shaped by our identities as researchers, as educators, and as clinicians. And sometimes these positions gave us insights, but sometimes they created interference. By naming and examining that complexity, we were able to produce a more careful, more ethical, and ultimately more useful account. It is valuable to reflect on your positionality and include it in your research write-ups for just this reason. So I hope these reflections resonate with those of you doing qualitative research, those of you supervising students or practicing in settings where these roles overlap. If they do, perhaps the invitation is to stay curious as to how you move between insider and outsider positions and what that movement makes possible. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Rona, for sharing those deep insights. That was a really interesting project that we delved into, trying to unravel positionality, and I hope that that was useful. I think we've had far too much fun sharing all of our ideas, and we've now whittled down the discussion time to just a few minutes. But for the diehards who are still with us, thanks for being here. I would like to open the floor to any questions. I think you can pop them into the chat or else put your hand up, and we can figure out how to unmute you and allow you to speak if you would like to do so. So the floor is open to anybody who has a question or a comment. I see. Thanks, Nabila. A really valuable session. Important takeaways. Thanks to the speakers. The work being done is inspiring. Thanks, Nabila. And Nabila is one of the collaborators on the interprofessional project. So lovely to have you here with us. Yeah, I should ask. I've actually put some questions instead of any questions. I'm taking a leaf out of John Heritage's book with his very well-known study where he found that just tweaking that question in a doctor's office, do you have any questions or do you have some questions, makes a tremendous difference to how patients respond. They're much more likely to respond to some questions than any questions. So yeah, the floor is open. If there are comments or questions that anybody has for any of our panelists, or just thoughts that you have based on what we've discussed and brought up in today's webinar, the floor is open. I'm sure many of you have to dash off to other things. But yeah, it would be nice to get a little bit of input or some feedback if you have any, or if you're working in similar spaces to the kinds of topics that we've discussed today. Kiva, do you want to go for it? Let me see if I can try and unmute you. There we go. I'll allow Mike. There we go. It should work. If you can unmute yourself.
Okay, thank you so much, Prof, for this really exciting presentation, and all presenters. I really appreciate. As a student, PhD student at University of KwaZulu-Natal. First of all, I need to introduce myself. I'm Kiva Joseph, an assistant lecturer in the Department of Communication Studies, Institute of Language Studies at Kampala University, Uganda, and I'm a PhD student. And my key area of focus is health comm. I have really appreciated the discussion to do with positionality, and the mere fact that I'm using the reflexive thematic analysis. So I have really enjoyed that discussion. I really look forward if it's possible to share the the slides, and then I take a deeper reading on positionality, on how I can bring it into my data analysis, and then presentation of findings for my research work. I really appreciate. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Kiva, and so good to hear from colleagues at other universities in South Africa. So thanks for your input. There's a comment here from Sophia. Thanks, Sophia. Thank you so much for these insightful talks. Are you getting any or some buy-in or feedback from practicing clinicians for any of these findings? Is there a way of feeding things up and out of university? Nancy, I don't know if you want to quickly talk perhaps about our future plans, moving from simulation into looking at real conversations. If you want to talk just briefly to that, thanks.
Okay, thanks, Jenny. Well, Sophia, one of the nice things, just before I breach into that, but one of the nice things that we're finding, so for example, when we first analyzed the videos that from the simulations that I showed, that one snippet of, that was from 2024. And then what was really nice, when I did lectures in 2025, I was able to take that information in and share it with students. Wait, no, 2025 to 2026, sorry. And was able to share it with students and tweak how I was training them with the communication skills. So like on a small scale, it's been really nice to use it as a tool to feed back into my own lecturing and own development of the students that I'm working with. However, we are also broadening this project, and we also wanting to understand, what do actual clinicians practicing with real live patients do when they're communicating with their patients. So we've just gotten medical ethics clearance so that we can start video recording clinicians with their patients, seeing what happens in these similar situations, so that we can also help that to inform how we're training our students. And then from that, we would love to build some communication training platforms for both students and clinicians, practicing clinicians. But we are just at the very beginning stages of this, so it's quite exciting to see where this will go. Thank you.
Sophia, and thanks, Nancy, for answering that. I see we've got a question here from Lo Lee in Melbourne. Great to have someone joining from the other side of the world. I recalled that Megan mentioned bringing in translators in the interaction, and that students don't necessarily have positive experiences with them. Megan, would you mind elaborating briefly on that question if you can? Thanks.
Hi, and thank you for the question. In terms of students struggling with translators, particularly in the genetic counselling interactions, is really that, unfortunately, not only in genetic services, but really nationally across South Africa, there are very few, if not any, medically trained translators and interpreters that are based in the hospitals or clinical facilities. And this really is problematic due to the multiple languages that we have in our country. Often most medical interactions take place in English, or alternatively in Afrikaans in some provinces, but they are not necessarily the first languages of many of the patients that come to the services for consultations. And due to the lack of having medically trained interpreters, particularly in genetic counselling consultations where there are quite complex concepts that are discussed, like things like chromosomes and DNA and molecular testing or genomic medicine, often the translators who are asked to assist, it's often someone like a nurse or a receptionist or an administrative clerk, or someone who can assist in the moment to help with the translating if the person is unable to speak English or Afrikaans. And this can really be challenging if the translator is unfamiliar with the medical topic and is unable to really find the right words and ability to translate that information. Also, what is problematic in genetic counselling is that it is mainly a neutral service, so you cannot be telling patients what they should be doing or what decision they should be making. So ethically, it can become quite contentious, where we have looked at data where interpreters have taken on a far more paternalistic or sort of direct role when it comes to telling patients what they should be doing in the decision making, and the genetic counselor who might not be familiar with the language hasn't picked it up in the session, and only later on, when we've looked at recordings, if it was in a research setting, or even later on when discussing things with patients, that there was far more direct advice given in the sessions, which it really is problematic. So that's a real gap in our healthcare context, is the lack of professionally trained interpreters and the ability to be trained in specific areas of medicine and healthcare.
Megan, I hope that answers the question. Yeah, that's a whole nother discussion for a whole nother day, is that the challenges of working across languages in our context. and something that we have worked on quite a number of times in various projects. Also doing some projects looking at, I've been looking at Google Translate and just how that really doesn't work well, but what that looks like in a simulated interaction. So that's a very important topic to be researching and looking at in our context specifically. Kiva, I see there's a hand still up. I presume that's an old one, but maybe you've got another question. Maybe it's an old hand. I don't see any more comments or questions in the chat or more hands. So I think without further ado, we'll call this webinar to an end and just say a very, very big thank you to those of you who took the time to attend today from around the world. It's really lovely to have such great input here. Also to have a lot of our collaborators on the webinar. This is very exciting work and work that we're really proud of, and looking forward to now doing the hard work of writing up some of this work into papers, because a lot of this is just hot off the press and we haven't had a chance to write it up yet. So that's the next step for us. But thank you, everyone. Please do visit the websites, the IC4CH and the HCOU one. We'd really love to hear more from you. So please feel free to contact us or contact me. I will pop my email address into the chat in case anybody has any further questions or would like to connect. But thanks, everyone, and have a good rest of the day. And we look forward to connecting again at a future date with another IC4CH webinar. Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.